So yeah, this is quite a simple app made this morning, but it's based on something that um, me and James built like a while ago. So here's just like a login screen. You log it in, and then on the first page here, you've got like a list of tickers, which I'll show you where these are getting pulled from in a bit. But the basic idea is that um, this would be a kind of app that a bank might use. At banks, they have obviously like trading desks where people can come and like buy and sell shares, like these different tickers here. They can come and buy and sell, and they also have compliance departments which basically put restrictions on which shares people can buy and sell. So there are lots of different rules regarding like what you're allowed to buy, what you're not allowed to buy, and at what times and so on. But one of the most simple things they do is they have like just literally lists of tickers which they put on what they call watch lists, or I think they also call them like blacklists, these kind of things. And these are like lists of tickers which, under no circumstances, people are allowed to trade. So, quite a simple app that we made before for one of these departments was something a bit like this, where they basically could see a list of all the different tickers that their company was working with, and then they had an option to add and remove them from these watch lists, or blacklists as we call them. So when it gets added to the list at this point, it signifies that it can't be traded anymore. So just on this screen here, you can see the functionality to add and remove the different tickers. And then you can see like this list of the ones that you've added basically on this screen here. And then just added like a really simple dashboard at the end just to show like another data integration basically, where people can come in and like load up different stock prices. So the point of today was to kind of talk through how this was made, but specifically to show a few kind of key features, and I think ones that some people have already started looking at. So the first thing we're going to look at is kind of how do we get this data into the app? Where's it coming from? So for that, we're going to take a look at the web services section. We're then going to look at how you can actually start processing the data. So there's different things that you might want to do with it, other than just simply displaying it on the screen. Then we're going to talk about kind of the option for storing data. So when you load this stuff in, as well as displaying on the screen, you could also want to store that in a data model. So I'm going to show you how you kind of set that up. And then finally, going to talk about the kind of front end configuration to actually set this whole thing up, like the visuals and stuff of the screen. So in terms of where the different data is coming from for the, I guess for the ticker list and for the dashboard of like tickers on here, we found this online API where you can load this data from. For anyone, I guess, slightly less technical, the API is basically just somewhere where you can come to fetch data. Different companies have different APIs that they make available. And when you come to like their main screens, they all basically look exactly the same. And I'm going to show you how that is by kind of showing you how you set it up in our app. So if you wanted to connect to this API and start kind of getting information out of it, what you can do is you can take any of these like example requests that they've given on their website and just stick them into the browser. So I think I've already run this one. It comes up in my search history. Yeah. And you can see that just like loads up a whole bunch of data. And that's basically the raw data that was getting displayed in this table here. So what we need to do to start off with is basically set this up so that our app can access this information here, which is getting loaded on this screen. And the way you do that is by coming down into the web services section at the bottom of the screen. A web service is another word basically for an API in this case. So if you want to, what you start off with by creating a new web service. This is the one that I created before. And to set this up, you have to look basically at how the URL here is set up. So this URL is broken up into different parts, which we'll just talk through now. So to start off with, you've got this kind of base section here, this api.marketstack.com. So we would take that and basically just copy it into where it says host here. Then at the start, you can see there's HTTPS, or you can also run it on HTTP. And what you can do then is just select the protocol here that corresponds with whatever's at the start of this URL. So you've got, I guess it should be HTTPS selected, and then host selected here. And that sets up the kind of base web service, the base for every single request you're going to make. Then on the right-hand side of the screen, you have the options for the web service endpoints. And these are the individual endpoints that you can hit on this particular API. So in this case, we've got this endpoint here, v1 end of day, or we can load like end of day data. But if we look at the tickers one, you can see we've got the same stuff at the start, but then we've got v1 tickers at the end. This is a different endpoint to load the tickers in this case. So what you do next is you come over here, you hit like the add endpoint button, and then you put in like that end path basically that you can see at the end of the URL here. So in this case, v1 tickers, but if we scroll up, the v1 end of day that I've just copied in here. So that way we kind of break the URL up, which we loaded in this screen, into different components. We've got like the base, and then we have like the actual end path on the end of it, and the protocol at the start. Once you've done that, if you look at the next part of this URL, you can see after the little question mark here, we have like this thing here. It says access key equals, and then we have like a random string, and then we have this part here. It says symbols equal, and there we've got a symbol, and the symbol that we're entering here basically defines what ticker is getting loaded. So if I was to switch this to like Apple, then it should load different information. This time you can see for the Apple ticker. This is the kind of protocol that this company basically created. And if you look through the documentation, it explains kind of different options you've got for stuff you can put in this last section here. But basically the things like the symbols are just like applying filters. So it filters for like Apple. Then I think you can apply other things like sorting to maybe sort the data in a certain way, that kind of thing. Everything after this question mark here is what's called query variables. So query variable is basically just a key and a value. So the key in this case is the word symbols, and the value is Apple AAPL. You can change the value like I showed you for something else, like a different symbol that you want to load, and then it will apply a different filter. So in our app, the way you set that last part of the URL up is you add these query variables down here in this variables section at the bottom of the screen. So in this case, you can see we've added the symbols one that I showed you, and I've also added this access key one. The access key is basically a key that you need to actually access the data. And again, that's something that this company has defined. If we look at the tickers one as well again, so the way the tickers one is set up is very similar but slightly different. So on the tickers one, again, you've got it's under the same web service. So you've got the base host and the base protocol set here. And then under the path in this case, you can see we've got a standard like path here. If I search for this one under, I guess, exchanges or something, I guess it's this section here. That's basically just being copied from here. What you can do in the case of exchanges, though, if you look through the kind of specification that this company has, is you can apply filters on the exchange that you want to load the information for. But this is a bit different. In this case, the way we applied a filter was by adding this symbols equals VOD at the end here, and that was after the question mark. But in this particular case, you can apply a filter by updating the actual path that comes before the query variables. So you can put in the actual exchange in here. So in this case, what we're using, if you take a look at the way this path is set up, is this particular part in the section here where we've got exchange. This part here is again a variable. This is something that we want to change depending on what kind of filter we're applying. So you might want to load tickers for one exchange or for another exchange or for a different exchange. So in this case, this section in the middle here is called a path variable, and that's configured by one, actually writing the exchange variable in here and putting these little curly braces around it, and two, by adding that same path variable down here in this bottom section. So you've got the query variable, which is the kind of key values that come after the question mark in this URL that we showed you. And then you also have options for path variables, which allow you to insert like a variable within the path itself here, like that. So that way, again, we basically, step one is we kind of break this full URL up into different components, into the protocol, host, the path, and then we define any kind of variables that are in that URL in this bottom section of the screen here. Once you've set that up, the next thing you have to think about is how the data is basically going to look when it comes back to you once you've actually loaded it. So if you take a look at this again here, you can see the data is basically looks like this. You've got like this section here at the start, and then you have another section here with the actual like prices in it, like the open, high, low, close, volume, and so on. If we were to, I guess, format that a bit better, this is you can kind of see it a bit neater what that would look like. So the data kind of looks like this. You've got like open, the price, high, low, close, and so on. So what you do then next in our app is you basically create a kind of model to put that information into, and the way the model is defined will have to correspond to how the data looks like here. So the way you create the model is you go one tab up to this custom models section here, and you can see you've created a model here called data, and this is specifically for this given web service that I was just showing you. And you can see it has the same values basically as was in the example data that we showed here. So open, high, low, close, symbol, and so on. So you basically go through and add different attributes to correspond to whatever's in here. So if you want to add a new attribute, you click the add attribute button, you enter in a label which will literally correspond to the label here. So you would just copy and paste that in, for example. And then you set a kind, which will be the kind of data that you're expecting to receive. So in this case, it's a number we're expecting with a decimal after it. So you'd select like number with decimal, for example, and go through that for each individual item in this like list basically that you've grabbed. An alternative to going through and copying these individually like I was showing you then is you can also come into this tab here, and in this tab here you can paste in any of these things like this. So you can literally just take this, copy it, and paste it, and hit the submit button, and that will automatically generate all of these for you. So you don't actually have to go through and just copy them out. You can just copy that particular thing in here and hit the submit button, and it will generate it for you. Once you've done that, you've kind of set up like the model for what the data is going to look like when it comes back. And that model, you basically tell this endpoint what model you want to put this information into by selecting it under the response variable section here. So this response variable is where you tell this particular web service endpoint what custom model you're going to be sticking this information into. So the way you do that is by clicking on this icon here. Again, you select a kind, which in this case will be a custom model, because that's the model that we just created. And then you select the actual model from here that corresponds to the one we just made a minute ago. So in this case, the one we're using is this one here, which I've called Exchange Data Container. And in the other one, it is one that we've just called Trade Data Container. And the Trade Data Container, if we just look at that, is this one here. And that basically includes that data that we showed here. So one other thing to point out is if you look at this response that you're getting again here, the response, you've got this like section which I've highlighted here, but you also have this section at the start as well. So if we were to take this whole thing and put it in here again, if I can overwrite it, just so I can format it again. Is that right? Yeah. This is how the whole kind of structure looks like. At the top, you've got this first kind of structure, and then afterwards, you've got this second one here, which has the actual information in it. So in other words, you have kind of nested structures. So you've got this one up here, which is one kind of model, which is under pagination. And then you've got this second one here under data, which contains the actual data. And this is like another model, basically. So if you look at the way we set this up here, you can basically, when you add an attribute, you can set the kind of that attribute equal to a custom model. And then you can select another custom model that you've created. And that allows you to basically put custom models inside custom models. So in this case, we have this trade data container model, but inside it, we've put this pagination model, which has the limit offset count and so on, and this data model. So you can see how that kind of maps back to here. But again, you could just take this whole thing and copy it into the code section here to actually automatically generate this stuff for you rather than copying it all in. So having set that up, you've basically defined now what this particular web service would look like. You've told the system kind of where it lives, what the protocol is, and then you've set up these different endpoints, which are like the locations of the data that you're going to be fetching. On its own, though, this doesn't actually do anything. It's just like the initial infrastructure, basically. What you have to do next is you have to take these web services that you've created, and then you can use them in different parts of the system. So if I go up a couple of tabs to the Actions tab here, for anyone who's not familiar with the concept of an action is basically where we run bits of functionality. So if we take this example here, which I think is called Run Web Service, here we're performing a specific action, a specific bit of functionality, and the bit of functionality we're performing here is actually running that particular web service that we created earlier. So when you create the action, you just give it a name, and then on the right hand side, you define what that action is actually going to be doing. And what that action is going to be doing is it's going to be performing a list of different events, as we call them. So if you want to create an event, you click on this plus button here, and that adds a new event you can see to this chain here. And when the action runs, it will basically perform each event in sequence. Each of the events can be doing a different thing. So one event might be to run that web service that we just created, but you might have other events to do things like send people emails, or log people into your app, log people out of your app, these kind of things. So when you create the event, the first thing you do is you pick the kind of event. So this is telling you what the event's actually going to do. So if we go back actually up one level, the kind of the event that we've picked here, like I said, you could pick something like send mail to send an email, or log out a user, log in a user. But here we've picked this event here called HTTP request. And what this event does is it runs one of those web services that we've created. Each event will have a different set of event options associated with it. And what you have to do when you're building your app is basically configure those different options. So in this case, the event that we've picked is one to run that web service we created. So the first thing you've got to do is you've got to say, okay, well, which web service are we going to run? So in this case, we only have one, so we pick that one. And then we say, okay, which endpoint within that web service do we want to run? If you remember in here, we had two. We had one to fetch data and one to fetch tickers. So in this case, we pick the one to fetch the data. And then after that, you can see we have this query variables section. And this corresponds to the query variables that you've created here. So here we created two query variables. We had the access key one, which is just, like I said, some kind of secure key to allow you to access the information. And then you have this symbol one here, and the symbol one is the filter to filter for specific symbols, specific tickers. So if we go back up to our action, you can see the same query variables here. And what you do now is you actually assign values to these variables. So you assign which particular symbol do you actually want to run this for. And the way you do that is by setting this equal to the value of another variable. We can kind of talk about that in more detail as we go on. But in this first example here, to keep things really simple, when you create your event, as well as the event options, at the bottom of the screen, you've got this variable section. And this variable section allows you to create variables, which you can then use in your event. So we've created a variable here called symbols, and we've given a value, it's like a hard-coded value, which we've set to AAPL, and then we've set this query variable equal to the value of this variable that we created here. So in other words, we've set this query variable equal to AAPL. So when we actually run this now, what will basically happen is it will take the information that we've put in here. So it will take the kind of host address, then it will take the endpoint path that we've set here. So it will take something like that. And then it will take whatever we put the query variables in the action. So in our case, we had AAPL. So it will basically construct something that looks like that. It will construct that for you kind of behind the scenes, and with the protocol that you've picked at the front as well. So like that. So it takes all the information and basically puts it all together, and then runs that in order to actually basically do exactly what we were doing here. So here we're running that same thing, but it'll be running it from our app now. In terms of how it actually gets run, or like when it gets run, So when you create your action, you'll see you have this advanced section here. And under the advanced section, you can pick a trigger. And the trigger basically defines what's going to actually trigger this given action to run. So for example, you could set this equal to schedule here, and then you could set this action up to run on like a schedule. So we could set it so that it ran like every minute, every 5 minutes or something like that. Alternatively, as we had here, you can set it to the trigger to endpoints. And what this means is that we can run this manually basically by clicking a button from the front end of your system. So if we just leave this page for 1 second and step down into this page here we have this endpoints page, and this endpoints page basically allows you to create endpoints for your own system. So what we were looking at in the web services section with this host and path and so on, this was endpoints that we were going to be hitting from some like third-party system. So from this company's system, we were going and hitting this particular URL, which belongs to this company. But in this endpoint section here, you can basically set up endpoints that belong to your app. So if I take a look at one that I've created already called Run Web Service, this is an example endpoint that I've created. You can see this is actually very, very similar to the web service endpoint that we created a minute ago. You have a path again that you enter, which is like the address of the given endpoint. And then at the bottom, you have the same kind of query, header, body, path variables, and so on. And this path combines with these variables to basically build up your end URL, which you can then go to in order to access given information. In this particular case, the only difference is that we don't have to set a host or protocol. And the reason for that is because this is running on your app. So the host is just going to be the address of your app, and the protocol will be HTTPS, because that's just the secure protocol that you can use. So having kind of created an endpoint on this page, if we then go back to the action we've created, you can see now under the trigger section, we can associate this action with that same endpoint, so with the Run Web Service endpoint. And what that now means is that when we run this given endpoint here, so when we click the Run button up here, it will run this same action. So at the moment, this action has just got the one event in it, which is going and fetching some information, going and running a web service request. When it runs that request, the request sends some data back to you, as we saw in the example here. And we've set some kind of custom model up, like we said before, that you can kind of put that data into. So under this section here where it says response as, this is basically the name that you're going to give to the variable that stores that data that comes back. So the data that's getting put into that custom model that we've created. So here we've just called that variable container. And what you can then do is under this response variable section here, you can select that container variable that the information is getting stored in. And what this now means is that when you hit this run button, when you run this endpoint, it's going to run all of this, and then the response, so what it sends back to us, is going to be what you select here. So in other words, it's going to be the container variable that we used here to store the response of the web service endpoint. So just to show you what I mean, if I hit like the run button up here, you can see now that we're getting information back, which basically corresponds to the information that we were getting back here. So just to recap, what we're doing is when we hit this run button, is we're going to an endpoint on our app, and then our app is running this action, which basically runs the web service that we set up, which fetches data from here, and then it's basically sending that data back in the response variable to our app. So now it's kind of possible to run this from our app rather than externally. What the next step would be then, having set all this up, is you can now then configure your front end, so your web app that you're actually building, to run this particular endpoint that you've created. So we looked before at the workflow tab over here. Just to recap, a workflow is basically something that the front end of your system, so the actual page, can run when a user interacts with your page. So for example, when the user clicks this load ticker button, at that point we want to run a given workflow, and that workflow wants to basically run this endpoint that we set up so we can actually get the data back for our front end app. So in the workflow section, you can see that we have this run web service option down here, and this is very similar to the actions that we looked at a moment ago. On the left, you just give it a name, and then on the right, you basically tell the workflow what kind of events you're going to be doing. So the first event that we have here is the run endpoint event, and this is going to run the endpoint that we just created. So it's going to run this same endpoint here. The difference now is that rather than like us having to come here and click this run button, we can now set this workflow up to kind of run that programmatically. And what we can then do, having created this workflow here, is if we go back to our design studio, we can select any of the components on the page. So in this case, we can select like the button component, and we can come over to the trigger tab over here, and we can set this trigger here to on click, and then we can grab that same workflow that we created. And now when we click this button, it will run this workflow. So we click this button, it will run this workflow, which runs the run web service endpoint, which is this endpoint here. And that endpoint will in turn run the action that we've created, which will in turn run this HTTP request event, which is the web service that we set up to access data from here. So it's basically, if we come back to this diagram that we kind of showed before, it's like a kind of 3-step process. You start off at your app. Your app runs a workflow to run a given endpoint. That endpoint triggers an action running, and in this case, that action is to go to the web service you've created and fetch some information out of it. And that information basically comes all the way back to your app. So that's kind of how you could set up a very kind of basic data integration to fetch this information. What I want to show you now is just a slightly more interesting example. So in that example that we just talked through here, like I said, we were kind of going to our endpoint, and then our endpoint was going to this external web service and then sending the information back. One of the problems you might have with that is that the web service that you're accessing, this kind of lives somewhere else, right? It belongs to another company, and there might be lots of different people accessing this from different places. So it could be slow to kind of access. You might also have problems that you get charged basically per request that you make. So every time you go and fetch information from here, the company might charge you for like accessing their data. So it doesn't, for those two reasons really, it doesn't always make sense to set your app up so that it's constantly going back here to fetch the information. The way it's set up at the moment is every time the user hits that load ticket button, we're kind of going all the way back up to this third-party company's endpoints and fetching information from there. What you could do instead, if you wanted to get kind of overcome those two problems, is rather than fetching the information from here every time, is you could just fetch the information from here once, and then you could store it in a data model that belongs to your app. And then once it's stored here, you could just access the data directly from this data model. That way, having loaded the information once, you wouldn't kind of have to do it again. You could just continually fetch it from here. So that would get over any problems of the other company's service being slow, and also overcome problems of being charged money every time you have to pull information out of it. So what we would do instead is we could set up an action to basically pull the information out of here and then store it in a data model here. And then we could set something up so that we could just pull information directly from this data model. And that's quite a standard way of setting up one of these kind of integrations. So the way you can do that is if you take a look at this slightly more complicated action, which I called run data connector here. What this action is doing then, so if we take a look at the kind of list of events on the right hand side, our first event here is exactly the same as the one that we had before. This is just a HTTP request to go and fetch some information. So again, you pick the web service that you're going to be running. You pick the endpoint for that web service. In this example, it's the tickers endpoint I'm using. And then that returns, you set up the different variables like we showed before, and then that returns some information which you give a name to in this response as section. So here we're getting back a list of tickers, and we're basically storing those tickers in a variable that we're calling exchange data container. Once you've done that, you can then add a second event. And in this second event, you can set something up to basically save the information that's come back. So under this tab here, we have the data models tab. And the data models, like we explained before, are somewhere where you can come to create kind of places to store persistent information. So in this case, we want to store the response of these web service endpoints. So we have to create a data model which has the kind of corresponding fields to store the different fields for this response here. So for example, we have this trade data container that we created, and you can see, similar to the custom model we've created before, it has the corresponding fields, so like date, load, close, volume, and so on. So the difference is the data model on this page will store this information persistently. So once you've saved it here, it will be saved there for good, and then you can access it later on. So we come here, basically, we click the new model button to create a new model. And then in the same way as we did on the other screen, you can either click here to, in this case, add properties to your model. I have to save your thing first. Or alternatively, again, you have this code section here where you could come and just paste in some like sample information from there, and then it will generate this data model for you. Once you've done that, you kind of have a persistent kind of data store set up where you can then start pushing information into. And the way you push the information into it is you use this second kind of event, which we've called the create event, because it's creating new information. For the create event, you'll see again you have a different set of event options underneath. The first option you have is this model option, where you pick the data model that you're going to be storing information in. So in this case, if you remember, the first endpoint I was running was this get exchange endpoint. So I want to store that in a corresponding data model. So this is one that I created called exchanges. But if we come down a bit, I'm also running that endpoint that we showed here, which is actually loading the trade data. And when that comes back, the create event I'm using here is putting it into that trade data model that we just saw here. Once you pick the model that you want to put the information into, you then basically go through and you add the different properties for that model just by clicking this add button here. So you can see add like a new property, and then you tell the system what information you're going to put into that property. So if we look again at the, if we take the first one, if we look at this HTTP request again, like I said, when the information comes back, we store it in a variable that we give a name to here. So in this case, we call it exchange data container. That's the name of the variable. And then if we go down to the create event, we pick the exchanges model, we pick the different properties that we want to put information into. And then if I click on this little cog icon, I can basically come up here and I can select that exchange data container, which stores the response of that web service endpoint. And then I can pick the information from that I want to write into the given property. So in this case, I want to take the acronym and write it into the acronym property. So I just come in here, go to there and grab the acronym option here and press OK. And then you go through and do that for the other ones here in the same way. In this example here, we're just writing kind of we're getting one value back and writing it. But if we have something like in this second example here, you can see we have a list of different information. So we have like a list of different open, high, low, close prices. So when we ran that here, you can see we have all these different open, high, low, close prices down the screen. So when we run this HTTP request here, the information that we're getting back, again, we're putting it in this variable that we're calling trade data container. This is basically a list of information in this case. So what we want to do is you want to basically cycle through that list and then create a new record in our trade data model, but for each record in that list. So to do that, you'll see we have this loop event, which we've got directly after this HTTP request event. What this loop event is doing is you pick a variable to basically loop through, so to iterate through. And here you can see we're picking that trade data container variable, which corresponds to the response as value here. So this is the variable that's storing all the information that we've got back. We're looping through that information. And then as we loop through that information, we get kind of one row at a time available. And again, you give that row a name. So we call that row single trade data in this case. And because you've given that row a name here, that means you can then use this individual row in the next event. So this time our create event is one step down. And here you can see the value that we're using to set the properties is this same single trade data that we stored the information in, that we stored the individual row in here. So in this example, we're running this web service request. We're getting back a list of information, and we're then kind of cycling through that information. And for every single row, we're naming each row single trade data, and we're then using that individual row to assign values to the properties in the persistent data model that we created before. So now when we run this whole action, it will basically take all of that data and it will stick it into the models that we've created here. So all the trade data we're pushing into this model here, and then I showed that we're putting the exchange's data into here. To have a quick kind of window into that, you can look in this Widgets tab here. This Widgets tab basically allows you to look inside the data models that you've created here and see what information you've got stored in them. So if I click on like the data one here, this has got the information for the trade data model, and you can see that we've basically pulled all that information in for the different symbols and put it in here. The way you set these widgets up is you click like the new widget button up here, give it a name, and then when you actually step into the widget, on the left hand side of the screen you see you've got a columns section here, and under this columns section here you can basically pick the columns from a given data model, and that will then display in the table down here. So we can pick trade data and then grab a bunch of columns, add them, and then that will load them into here. So you kind of get a quick window into what information you've put into those models, so that you can see that you've kind of set this whole thing up correctly. In this particular example, I've set the trigger to endpoint again, and I've created an endpoint which allows me to run this manually kind of on click. If you're running this as like a kind of production environment for like a real app, you'd probably have the trigger set to schedule, and then you could schedule this to run like every 5 minutes or something, and just download the latest information and push it into your data model. So to change that, you just have to switch the trigger here, and everything else stays exactly the same. Now the information is in the data model. If you want to access it in kind of your app, you can now create your, again, own endpoints, similar to the endpoints that we've got here. But those endpoints could read information, that they could run actions to read information directly from your data models rather than from the third-party web service now. So as an example, I think I have one here called let's see, get trade data here. So this get trade data endpoint, if I go and look under the action section here, you can see I have a action called get trade data with the trigger set to endpoint and the endpoint equal to this particular endpoint that I've created here. And this is a very, very simple action. All this action is doing is grabbing the information out of the data model here. And the way you do that is, again, with the concept of a variable. You come down here and you create a variable. You set its kind to collection. A variable with a kind of collection basically is a variable which is getting set from any of the data in your data model. So you set the kind equal to collection, and then you pick the model that you want to get the data out of. So in this case, the trade data model. And now this particular variable will basically grab the data out of this model in order to populate this variable. And then, as I showed you in the other example, you then have this response variable section here, and you can make that equal to any particular variable that you've got available, which in this case will just be the one that you've created down here. So we set this equal to this market stack end of day variable that I've created. So now if we run this particular endpoint, we'll have to give it a ticker in this case, it will grab that information, but now it's grabbing it directly from the trade data model rather than going to this third-party web service. So if we take a look at the kind of architecture diagram now, the way this is set up now is we have this action here, which could be running, like I said, on a schedule. And this action is going and fetching information from our web service. It's then taking that information and sticking it into our persistent data store over here. And then we then have a endpoint which we can run, and that endpoint is running an action that's reading information directly out of this data model. So as a kind of final step, what you could then do is, if we go back to the front end design, is on this load ticket option, when you click this, we were running this run web service workflow. What we could do now is we could take a different workflow, which is one I've got here called get trade data, and we could basically run that different endpoint. So in this case, we're running the get trade data endpoint that we showed here. And that's going to be, like I said, running the endpoint to fetch information directly out of our data model.